We are taught to look at the Renaissance and see marble. We stand in museums, staring up at the David or the expansive domes of Florence, and we see the birth of Western culture. We are told these were gifts from benevolent patrons who loved beauty. That is the curated version. That is the narrative paid for by the winners. But if you look past the canvas, past the polished stone and the romanticized history, you find something much colder. You find a ledger. The Renaissance wasn't just a cultural explosion. It was, in many ways, the most successful money laundering operation in human history. The beauty wasn't the point. The beauty was the bribe. The Medici family did not rise to command popes and kings because they were generous. They rose because they perfected a crime that the world's most powerful institutions were too compromised to prosecute. They built a dynasty on a foundation of sin, and then they bought the church that outlawed it. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks loudest. If you want to understand the machinery behind the history books, subscribing ensures you're part of every investigation. To understand how a single family managed to privatize the power of the European state, we have to strip away the glamour of the 16th century and go back to the dirt and danger of the late 14th. We have to go to Florence, 1397. This was not a city of philosophers yet. It was a shark tank. Florence was a republic in name, but an oligarchy in practice, ruled by a tangled web of merchant families who were constantly at war with one another. Blood feuds were settled in the streets, and financial feuds were settled in the dark. In this chaotic ecosystem, there was a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. He was not a warrior. He was not a flamboyant aristocrat. He was a man who understood the one universal language that transcended borders, languages, and armies: liquidity. Giovanni was the founder of the Medici Bank, but calling it a bank is a modern simplification that hides the danger of what he was actually doing. In 1397, banking was not a respectable profession. It was a mortal sin. This is the critical context that most biographies gloss over. The Catholic Church, the supreme moral and political authority of the medieval world, had explicitly banned usury. Usury, the act of charging interest on a loan, was considered theft from God. The logic was theological but absolute. Time belongs to God alone. A banker who charges interest is selling time, which is not his to sell. Dante Alighieri, writing his Inferno just a few generations prior, placed usurers in the seventh circle of hell, forced to sit on burning sand beneath a rain of fire for eternity. This wasn't just a metaphor to the men of the 14th century. It was a terrifying physical reality. They believed, with total sincerity, that if they died with interest-bearing accounts on their books, their souls would be incinerated. Yet, the economy of Europe was growing. Kings needed to fund wars. Merchants needed to buy wool and silk. The world needed credit, but the law of God forbade it. This was the paradox that paralyzed Europe. The demand for capital was infinite, but the supply was strangled by the fear of hell. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici saw this not as a prohibition, but as a market inefficiency. He realized that if he could solve the theological problem, he could monopolize the financial market. He didn't need to change the law, he just needed to change the vocabulary. The crime of the Medici, the banking crime that built their empire, was a masterclass in technicalities. They invented a system of financial camouflage so sophisticated that it fooled the Vatican itself. The mechanism was called the Bill of Exchange. On the surface, it looked like a simple currency conversion. A merchant in Florence would deposit florins with the Medici and receive a piece of paper, a bill, that allowed him to withdraw the equivalent amount in pounds in London or ducats in Venice after a set period, usually 90 days. The trick was in the exchange rate. The Medici would deliberately undervalue the currency in the future transaction. They weren't charging interest. That would be usury. They were simply charging a fee for the risk of moving currency across borders and the fluctuation of exchange rates. It was a lie, of course. The risk was calculated, and the profit margin was fixed. It was interest by another name. They were lending money at a profit, usually between 8 and 12%, but because no interest rate was ever written down on paper, they could claim plausible deniability before the priests. This subtle shift in paperwork did something revolutionary. It turned a mortal sin into a business model. Giovanni established his headquarters in Florence, but the real power of the Medici Bank lay in its decentralized structure. This was the second part of the strategy. He didn't just build a bank, he built an intelligence agency. He placed partners in Rome, Venice, Geneva, London, and Bruges. These weren't just branches, they were listening posts. In an era before the telephone or the telegraph, information moved at the speed of a horse. The Medici couriers were often faster than royal messengers. A Medici partner in London would know the outcome of a battle in France before the King of England did. This information asymmetry gave them an unprecedented edge. They knew which shipments were delayed, which monarchs were bankrupt, and which cardinals were desperate for cash. Giovanni de' Medici was a man of shadows. His personal motto was, "Envy is a weed that should not be watered." He advised his sons to stay out of the public eye, to dress modestly, to hold no public office unless forced to. He understood that, in a republic like Florence, visible power was a target. The goal was to control the puppets without being seen pulling the strings. But there was a limit to how much money one could make by simply exchanging currency for wool merchants. The real wealth, the kind of wealth that buys armies and reshapes maps, lay in the coffers of the church. The papacy was the largest financial institution on earth. It collected tithes from every parish in Christendom, from the frozen coasts of Scotland to the sun-baked hills of Sicily. It was a river of gold flowing toward Rome. But the church had a problem. It was terrible at moving money. Collecting taxes in coin was dangerous. Wagons of gold were heavy, slow, and easy targets for bandits. The Pope needed a way to move wealth across the continent instantly and securely. He needed the Medici network. But for Giovanni to capture the papacy as a client, he would need to take a gamble that went against his cautious nature. He would have to stop laundering money for merchants and start laundering power for a pirate. This brings us to the moment the Medici stopped being mere bankers and started being kingmakers. It began with a man named Baldassare Cassa. Cassa was not a holy man. He was a former pirate, a soldier of fortune who had bought his way into the church hierarchy. He was ambitious, ruthless, and entirely corrupt. Exactly the kind of man the Medici could do business with. Cassa had his eyes on the papacy, but the church was fractured by the Great Schism, with rival popes claiming authority. The path to the throne required bribes. Massive, unprecedented bribes. Giovanni de' Medici looked at Cassa and saw an opportunity. If the Medici bankrolled Cassa's campaign to become pope, and if Cassa won, the Medici would become God's bankers. They would handle the accounts of the Holy See. They would take a percentage of every tithe paid in Europe. It was a gamble of existential proportions. If Cassa lost, the Medici would be bankrupt and likely executed for heresy or treason. If he won, they would own the financial infrastructure of the Western world. This was the pivotal crime. It wasn't just usury anymore. It was the purchase of the highest office in Christendom. Giovanni opened the vaults. The gold flowed. The bribes were paid. And in 1410, Baldassare Cassa was elected Pope John XXIII. The gamble paid off. The Medici were now the official bankers of the papacy. Suddenly, the sin of usury didn't matter as much, because the men enforcing the laws were the ones borrowing the money. The Medici Bank began to operate with a level of impunity that no other merchant family could match. They had bought the ultimate insurance policy. But with this new power came a new level of scrutiny. The old nobility of Florence, the Albizzi family, watched the rise of these upstart bankers with growing hatred. They saw the Medici not as clever businessmen, but as a cancer on the Republic. The tension in Florence began to tighten. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about who owned the soul of the city. Giovanni tried to keep his head down, urging his sons to remain invisible, but you cannot hide a mountain of gold. The bill of exchange had made them rich, but the papal account made them dangerous. And in the cutthroat politics of Italy, being dangerous is a death sentence if you don't strike first. Giovanni's genius was in building the engine. He constructed the legal loopholes, the international network, and the alliance with the church. But he was an old man and the world was changing. The Renaissance was beginning to bloom, and it required a different kind of leader. It required someone who didn't just want to hoard gold, but who wanted to weaponize it. As Giovanni lay dying in 1429, he left his son, Cosimo, a vast fortune and a simple instruction: be inoffensive to the rich and strong, and charitable to the poor and weak. It was wise advice. It was also advice that Cosimo would have to completely ignore if the family was to survive what was coming. The banking crime had been committed. The foundation was laid. But the walls were closing in, and the Medici were about to learn that when you command the debts of kings, you inherit their enemies. The era of the shadow banker was ending. The era of the shadow ruler was about to begin. To understand how a family of wool merchants hijacked the destiny of Europe, we must first look at what was missing from the official ledgers. History books often describe the Medici rise as a triumph of astute business, a victory of capitalism before the term existed. But that narrative is a polite fiction. It obscures the darker reality that the entire Medici Empire was built on a foundation of theological tax evasion. In the 15th century, charging interest on a loan was not merely illegal. It was a mortal sin. Usury was considered violence against God, a theft of time which belonged only to the Creator. A banker who charged interest was destined for the deepest circles of hell, and perhaps more immediately, the executioner's block. Yet, the Medici vaults were overflowing. They weren't just lucky. They had engineered a system of financial camouflage so sophisticated that it blinded both the church and the state to the reality of their operations. They called it the cambium per literas, exchange by bills. On the surface, it looked like a simple currency conversion. A merchant in Florence would deposit florins with the Medici, receiving a document promising repayment in a different currency, perhaps pounds in London, at a later date. It appeared to be a service of convenience, a way to move money across dangerous roads without carrying gold. But hidden within the exchange rates was the profit. The Medici rigged the conversion to ensure that when the money returned to them, it carried a surplus. It was interest disguised as fluctuation, usury masked as logistics. This was the dry exchange, a mechanism that allowed them to sell time while pretending to sell distance. It was the first true instance of shadow banking, creating a parallel economy where the rules of the church did not apply, provided the paperwork was sufficiently vague. This subterfuge required more than just clever accounting. It required protection. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici knew that money alone was vulnerable. Gold could be seized. Banks could be burned. To secure the kind of permanence he craved, he needed to indebt a power that was untouchable. He needed the church. But the church was fractured, a chaotic mess of competing claims and schisms. In the early 1400s, the papacy was not a singular throne but a battlefield. This chaos, which terrified other merchants, looked to Giovanni like an investment opportunity. He wasn't looking for a safe bet. He was looking for a desperate man. He found him in Baldassare Casa. Casa was not a holy man. By most accounts, he was a former pirate, a man of violent appetites and military ambition who had pivoted to the church as a path to power. He was a cardinal with an army, a warlord investments. To the established banking families of Florence, the Albizzi, the Strozzi Casa was a liability. He was volatile, dangerous, and morally bankrupt. But Giovanni saw the geometry of the situation differently. He understood that a man with a questionable past and immense ambition has a specific need that a pious man does not. He needs cash, and he needs it without questions. The Medici opened their coffers to Casa. They funded his campaigns, paid his bribes, and maintained his retinue. It was a staggering risk. If Casa failed, the Medici would be ruined. Their fortune dissolved into the pockets of a disgraced cardinal. For years, the ledgers bled red. It was a slow, agonizing drain on the family resources, a gamble that kept Giovanni awake while the rest of Florence slept. But this was the price of entry into the highest tier of shadow rule. You do not buy a king when he is on the throne. You buy him when he is in the mud. In 1410, the gamble paid out. The Council of Pisa convened, and through a mixture of diplomacy, intimidation, and Medici gold, Baldassare Casa was elected Pope John XXIII. The pirate had become the vicar of Christ. The return on investment was immediate and absolute. The Medici were named the official bankers of the Curia. This title was worth more than any army. It meant that every tithe collected from a parish in London, every indulgence purchased in Hamburg, and every church tax levied in Paris flowed through the Medici network. The church was the largest corporation in the world, and the Medici were now its treasury. They took a commission on every transaction, skimming the wealth of Christendom as it moved toward Rome. But the true power lay in the leverage. By holding the Pope's purse strings, they held his attention. They could delay funds to pressure a decision or expedite gold to fund a war. The line between the Vatican's divine will and the Medici's commercial interests began to blur. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks loudest. If you want to understand the machinery behind the history books, subscribing ensures you're part of every investigation. With the papacy secured, the Medici transformed. They were no longer just merchants. They were an institution. The bank's headquarters in Florence became a nexus of international intelligence. Their branch managers in Geneva, Bruges, and Avignon were not just counting coins. They were gathering secrets. A letter from a branch manager could contain the price of wool in England, or it could contain news of a brewing civil war or a royal marriage. Information moved faster through the Medici network than through any royal courier service. They knew which kings were solvent and which were desperate weeks before the rumors reached the courts. This information asymmetry allowed them to manipulate markets and political alliances with surgical precision. However, in Florence, visibility is a death sentence. The city was a republic, fiercely proud of its democratic traditions, even if they were often manipulated. The older noble families, led by the intense and aristocratic Rinaldo degli Albizzi, watched the Medici ascent with growing paranoia. The Albizzi were the old guard, warriors and statesmen who believed power belonged to those with ancient blood, not to upstart moneylenders from the Mugello Valley. They saw the Medici not as brilliant innovators, but as a cancer on the Republic, a family that was buying the state piece by piece. Giovanni sensed this rising tide of envy. He famously advised his sons, "Be envious of no one, and avoid being the cause of envy in others." He tried to make the Medici invisible. He walked the streets in modest robes, refused public office, and spoke softly in the Signoria. He played the role of the humble citizen, the reluctant servant of the people. It was a masterful performance of anti-charisma. He understood that in a city of wolves, the tall poppy gets cut. By making himself appear boring, he made himself difficult to attack. How do you rally a mob against a man who seems to want nothing but the quiet prosperity of the city? But his son, Cosimo, was different. Cosimo had been educated in the humanist traditions. He had traveled with the Pope. He had seen the world beyond the Tuscan hills. He understood that the era of modesty was ending. The wealth they had accumulated was too vast to hide under a bushel. The Albizzi were not fooled by Giovanni's plain robes. They knew the numbers. They knew that the Medici could buy the entire city council twice over. The conflict was inevitable. It was a collision between two eras, the feudal power of the sword represented by the Albizzi and the modern power of the ledger represented by the Medici. As Giovanni aged, the restraint that held the family back began to fray. The crime of their rise, the usury, the bought pope, the monopoly on church finances, was becoming an open secret. The Albizzi began to gather allies, whispering that the Medici were tyrants in waiting, that they intended to overthrow the Republic and install themselves as princes. They weren't entirely wrong. The Medici didn't want a crown, but they wanted the control a crown provided. They wanted the state to function as a subsidiary of the bank. The tension in Florence became physical. Men loyal to the Albizzi and men loyal to the Medici began to clash in the piazzas. The city was polarizing, splitting into factions that would tear the Republic apart. The death of Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in 1429 removed the last check on this volatility. Cosimo was now the head of the family. He was 40 years old, astute, cultured, and far less willing to bow his head. He inherited the greatest fortune in Europe, but he also inherited the target on his back. The Albizzi saw the transition as their moment to strike. They believed the son would lack the father's caution, that he could be baited into a mistake. They prepared their trap carefully. They wouldn't attack the bank directly. That would destroy the city's economy. Instead, they would attack the man. They began to compile a dossier of crimes, real and imagined. They accused Cosimo of elevating himself above the ordinary citizen, of using his wealth to corrupt the courts, of plotting against the liberty of Florence. The machinery of the state, which the Medici had tried so hard to influence, was being turned against them. The shadow rulers were about to be dragged into the light. The strategy was simple: isolate Cosimo, accuse him of treason, and execute him before his money could save him. The banking crime that had built their empire was about to become the evidence for their destruction. We are often told that political downfalls are public spectacles, loud trials and swift executions. But the true dismantling of a dynasty begins in silence. It starts with a summons that looks like routine bureaucracy, a polite invitation that conceals a cage. When the order came for Cosimo de' Medici to appear before the Signoria, the government council, the official reason was a simple consultation. The reality was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to sever the head of the banking hydra. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, the architect of this coup, understood that you cannot simply murder the richest man in Europe in broad daylight. You must first strip him of his legitimacy, label his financial network a conspiracy against the state, and then, when he is isolated within the stone walls of the palazzo, let the silence do the rest. On September 7, 1433, Cosimo walked into the palace of the Signoria. He was not naive. He had been warned by friends that the council had turned against him, that the ballot boxes had been stuffed with Albizzi loyalists. Yet, to refuse the summons would be an admission of guilt. He entered the heavy wooden doors, and the trap snapped shut. He was immediately seized, not by guards, but by the weight of the state itself, and marched up the winding stairs to the Albergatino, the little hotel, a cramped, suffocating cell located in the tower of the palazzo. From this high vantage point, he could hear the city of Florence below, the city his gold had built, continuing its rhythm without him. But inside the cell, the air was thick with the threat of assassination. For 4 days, the most powerful banker in the Western world refused to eat. He sat in the semi-darkness, staring at the bread and water placed before him, terrified that a single crumb was laced with arsenic. The Albizzi faction was debating his fate downstairs. Rinaldo demanded death. He argued that as long as Cosimo lived, his money would find a way to corrupt the state. He was right, but Rinaldo made a fatal calculation error. He assumed that prison walls could stop the flow of capital. He did not understand that for a man like Cosimo, currency was not just metal. It was a language that could be spoken through stone. Even from inside the Albergatino, the Medici network was active. Cosimo, weak from hunger but sharp in mind, managed to make contact with his jailer. He didn't offer threats. He offered a transaction. With a few whispered words and a promise of payment that would secure the man's family for generations, the jailer became a courier. Through this channel, Cosimo reached out to the very men meant to judge him. He bribed the Gonfalonier, the head of the government, with a massive sum of 1,000 florins. He paid another 800 to other officials. While Rinaldo degli Albizzi was screaming for an execution in the council chamber, the men listening to him were already feeling the weight of Medici gold in their pockets. The sentence was not death. It was exile. Cosimo was banished to Venice for 10 years. Rinaldo was furious, sensing that he had won the battle but lost the war. Yet he could not override the will of the council. On October 3rd, Cosimo was escorted out of the city. He left quietly, without protest. To the casual observer, it looked like the end of the Medici era. The upstart bankers had been crushed by the old aristocracy. But this is where the genius of the shadow ruler reveals itself. Cosimo didn't just leave with his clothes and his family. He took the bank with him. When Cosimo arrived in Venice, he was not treated as a criminal in exile. He was received like a visiting head of state. The Venetians, rivals to the Florentines, understood exactly what had just walked into their city. It wasn't a refugee. It was an economic engine. Cosimo transferred his capital, his clerks, and his lending operations to Venice. The impact on Florence was immediate and catastrophic. The flow of credit that lubricated the Florentine economy dried up overnight. Projects stalled. The currency destabilized. The Albizzi government suddenly found themselves in charge of a city that was hemorrhaging wealth. They had the titles and the offices, but they did not have the liquidity. Back in Florence, the mood shifted with terrifying speed. The shopkeepers, the weavers, and the lesser merchants began to realize that their prosperity was tethered not to the noble Albizzi name, but to the Medici ledger. A year passed, then another. The city was bleeding. Rinaldo degli Albizzi tried to maintain control through force, but you cannot intimidate an economy into recovering. The banking crime of usury that the Medici were accused of was suddenly missed. The people didn't care about the theological implications of interest. They cared that there was no money to pay for grain or defense. The pressure cooker exploded in 1434. A new signoria was drawn by lot, a system the Albizzi thought they had rigged, but chance is a cruel mistress. The new council was pro-Medici. The realization hit Rinaldo like a physical blow. The exile was over. He attempted a desperate, armed uprising to stop the recall decree, occupying the streets with his soldiers. But the will of the city had turned. The Pope himself, Eugene IV, who was staying in Florence at the time, intervened as a mediator, but his sympathies and his debts lay with the Medici. Rinaldo was persuaded to lay down his arms under a guarantee of safety. It was a lie. Cosimo returned to Florence exactly 1 year after he left. He did not ride in with an army. He rode in with a ledger. The crowds cheered him as a savior, the father of the country. But the man who returned was not the same man who had left. The imprisonment in the tower had changed him. The brush with death had stripped away any lingering naivety about the rules of the game. He realized that being a private citizen with a lot of money was dangerous. To survive, he had to be the state. He would never hold the official title of prince or duke. He would remain, on paper, a private citizen. But he immediately moved to ensure that what happened to him could never happen again. The mercy he had been shown, the commutation of death to exile, was a mistake he would not repeat with his enemies. The Albizzi and their allies were summoned. There were no bribes this time. They were banished, their properties confiscated, their families scattered across Europe. Rinaldo, the man who had tried to be a kingmaker, died in exile, broken and penniless. Cosimo then turned his attention to the political machinery of Florence. He realized that the random selection of officials, the democratic lottery that Florence prided itself on, was a vulnerability. It allowed for unpredictability, and banking despises unpredictability. He introduced a new committee, the Accoppiatori, a group of men handpicked by him who were granted the power to select candidates for office. The lottery remained in name, but the names in the bag were now curated. This was the masterstroke of the Medici crime family. They didn't destroy the Republic. They hollowed it out from the inside. They kept the symbols of freedom, the councils, the votes, the debates, but they stripped them of function. Every decision of consequence was made not in the palace of the Signoria, but at the dinner table in the Medici palace. The government became a mask worn by the bank. With his domestic enemies crushed and the political system rigged in his favor, Cosimo looked outward. He had the money, he had the city, but to secure his dynasty against the kings of Europe, he needed something more than gold. He needed legitimacy. He needed the church. The upcoming Council of Florence, a massive gathering of Eastern and Western church leaders, presented an opportunity that money could buy, provided you had enough of it. It was time to purchase salvation itself. The shadow ruler was about to step onto the global stage, and the price of admission would be the greatest transfer of wealth the city had ever seen. Most historians frame the Council of Florence as a desperate spiritual summit, a final attempt to heal the schism between East and Western Christianity before the Ottoman shadow swallowed Constantinople. They speak of theology, of filioque clauses, of the Holy Spirit. But if you look past the robes and the incense, you find a different reality buried in the ledgers. This was not merely a religious convocation. It was a hostile takeover of the geopolitical landscape. The narrative suggests a meeting of minds. The accounts reveal a purchase of souls. Cosimo de' Medici did not just host a council. He bought the exclusive rights to the legitimacy of the Western world, and he did it with a line of credit that would bind the papacy to his family for generations. The opportunity arose from failure. The council had originally gathered in Ferrara, a city ill-equipped to handle the sheer scale of the entourage accompanying the Byzantine emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople. Disease was breeding in the streets, and the papal treasury was running dangerously low. Pope Eugenius IV was on the verge of a humiliating collapse. He had summoned the East to beg for aid, yet he could barely afford to feed his guests. This was the moment of vulnerability Cosimo had been waiting for. He didn't offer a donation. He offered a relocation package. He proposed moving the entire council, hundreds of bishops, scholars, the Emperor John VIII Paleologos, and their massive retinues to Florence. He would underwrite the entire operation. Every meal, every lodging, every ceremony. It was a maneuver of staggering arrogance disguised as piety. By moving the council to Florence, Cosimo physically shifted the center of gravity of the Christian world into his own backyard. When the Byzantine delegation arrived in February 1439, it was a spectacle designed to overwhelm. The citizens of Florence, accustomed to the drab wool of merchants, stared in silence at the silken robes of the East, the exotic beards, the imperial dignity of a dying empire. But for Cosimo, this parade was an asset acquisition. He was importing the prestige of the ancient Roman Empire and grafting it onto a city of bankers. The cost was astronomical. The Medici Bank poured over 4,000 florins into the initial setup alone, a sum that could have purchased entire towns. But Cosimo understood the difference between price and value. The price was gold. The value was leverage. By funding the Pope's survival, Cosimo transformed the pontiff from a spiritual superior into a financial dependent. Eugenius IV could issue bulls and excommunications, but he could not pay for the wine at his own table without a nod from the Medici palace. This inversion of the natural order, where the banker holds the leash of the vicar of Christ, was the true revolution of the Renaissance. It was the birth of soft power. While the bishops argued over the procession of the Holy Spirit in the Santa Maria Novella, Cosimo was conducting business in the shadows. The presence of the Eastern Emperor brought trade opportunities that bypassed the Venetian monopoly. It opened back doors to the Levant that had been closed for decades. Furthermore, the influx of Greek scholars, men like Gemistos Plethon, brought with them the lost texts of Plato and the hermetic secrets of the ancient world. Cosimo collected these men just as he collected bad debts. He realized that information was a currency more stable than the florin. By monopolizing the intellectual capital of the East, he ensured that Florence would become the indispensable brain of Europe. If you wanted wisdom, you came to Florence. If you wanted salvation, you came to Florence. And if you wanted either, you dealt with the Medici. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks loudest. If you want to understand the machinery behind the history books, subscribing ensures you're part of every investigation. The brilliance of Cosimo's scheme lay in its invisibility. He held no official title during the council. He sat on no throne. He walked the streets in the modest red lucco of a common burgher, bowing to the cardinals he effectively owned. He allowed the Pope to have the glory. He allowed the Florentine Signoria to have the pomp. But everyone in that city, from the lowest stable boy to the Emperor of Byzantium, knew who had paid for the bread they ate. This is the essence of the shadow ruler archetype, the refusal to take the crown in exchange for the ability to control the king. The council concluded with a nominal union of the churches, a diplomatic triumph that was largely meaningless in practice as the East rejected it soon after. But for the Medici, the success was absolute. The prestige of Florence skyrocketed. The bank's reputation as the only institution capable of financing global events was cemented. More importantly, the papacy was now structurally intertwined with the Medici Bank. The church's revenue streams, tithes, indulgences, taxes from across Christendom, began to flow through Medici branches. They became the Pope's deposit box and his collection agency. This financial intimacy allowed Cosimo to navigate the dangerous waters of Italian politics with a shield of papal immunity. Who would dare attack the Pope's banker? To strike at the Medici was to strike at the solvency of the Holy See. Cosimo had woven his private ambition so tightly into the fabric of public religion that they could no longer be separated. He had laundered his usury through the sanctity of the church. However, this power came with a terrifying maintenance cost. The network Cosimo built was fragile, dependent on his personal ability to balance the books and the egos of volatile princes. He was managing a continental house of cards. As the council dispersed and the dignitaries returned home, Cosimo was left with a city that felt like the capital of the world, but also with a list of enemies who saw exactly what he had done. The Albizzi were gone, but new rivals were watching. They saw that the Medici power did not come from God or the vote. It came from the ledger, and ledgers can be stolen. The psychological shift in Florence was palpable. The Republic was still a republic in name, but the citizens had tasted empire. They had seen the Emperor of the East bow to their leading citizen. They began to look at Cosimo not as a neighbor, but as a father, pater patri. This was the most dangerous phase of the crime, when the victim falls in love with the captor. The Florentines surrendered their liberty not at sword point, but in exchange for the glory Cosimo bought them. He gave them Donatello, he gave them Brunelleschi, he gave them the council. In return, they gave him their silence. As the 1440s approached, Cosimo's grip tightened. He began to use the tax system as a weapon, a method far more subtle than the dagger but equally lethal. He didn't need to exile his enemies anymore. He simply adjusted the tax rolls until they were bankrupt. The Catasto tax reform, ostensibly a measure of fairness, became a tool of political precision. He could bleed a rival dry without ever raising his voice. This weaponization of bureaucracy is the hallmark of the modern deep state, pioneered 5 centuries ago in a small Tuscan banking house. The stage was now set for the next evolution of the Medici plan. They had conquered the city. They had captured the church. Now they looked outward to the great monarchies of Europe. The kings of France and England were perpetually broke, fighting 100-year wars on borrowed dime. Cosimo saw them not as sovereigns, but as high-risk clients. The banking crime was about to go international. The Medici were done playing with city-states. It was time to foreclose on nations. Most historical records frame the Medici expansion during this period as a triumph of commercial enterprise, a golden age where Italian efficiency conquered the chaotic markets of the north. They show you maps of branch offices opening in London, Bruges, Geneva, and Lyon as if the Medici were simply exporting the concept of the modern franchise. But that perspective is a deliberate simplification that ignores the mechanism beneath the map. The Medici were not merely opening banks. They were installing listening posts and leverage points inside the treasuries of foreign crowns. This was not just commerce. It was the construction of the first private intelligence network in Europe, disguised as a ledger. To understand how a family of wool merchants could foreclose on nations, you have to look at the specific asset they leveraged to bypass the divine right of kings. They realized that while a king commands armies, he is usually cash poor, waiting on taxes that are slow to collect. The Medici solved the liquidity crisis for the monarchs of Europe, but the price of that solution was sovereignty. The first domino to fall was not a kingdom, however, but the spiritual center of the world. The gamble began with a man named Baldassare Casa. In the polite history books, Casa is a cardinal who became Pope John XXIII. In the unedited archives, Casa was a former pirate, a man of violent ambition whose military campaigns required vast sums of gold. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici saw something in Casa that no other banker dared to touch. He saw a distressed asset with infinite upside. The Medici Bank financed Casa's entire career, paying for the bribes, the mercenaries, and the influence required to secure his election during the Great Schism. It was a wager that could have bankrupted the family instantly. Instead, it handed them the keys to heaven's vault. When Casa became pope, the Medici were named the depositaries of the apostolic chamber. This is the moment the family ceased to be bankers and became an institution. They were now responsible for collecting the tithes owed to Rome from every parish, diocese, and abbey across Christendom. If a bishop in rural England sent tax money to the Pope, it traveled through the Medici network. If a noble in Spain paid for a dispensation, the gold weighed down Medici scales. They held the church's operating capital. More importantly, They often delayed the transfer of these vast sums to Rome, using the float, the time between collection and deposit, to invest in their own ventures. They were trading with God's money, interest-free. But the true genius of their criminal architecture wasn't just in holding the money. It was in cornering the market on the materials that made money possible. This brings us to the alum monopoly, perhaps the most sophisticated example of racketeering in the 15th century. Alum was a mineral salt essential for the textile industry. It was the chemical that allowed dye to bind to wool. Without it, the vibrant reds and blues of the Italian Renaissance would wash out in the rain. For decades, the best alum came from the Ottoman Empire, meaning European Christians were paying Muslims for the privilege of clothing themselves. Then, in 1461, a massive deposit of high-quality alum was discovered in Talfa, within the Papal States. The Medici immediately grasped the geopolitical implication. They approached the Pope with a proposition that would make a modern cartel look amateur. They proposed that the Church declare the Turkish alum to be infidel goods. The Pope issued a bull excommunicating any Christian who bought alum from the Turks, framing it as a mortal sin. Simultaneously, the Medici secured the exclusive contract to manage and distribute the papal alum from Talfa. The result was a vertical monopoly enforced by the threat of eternal damnation. The Medici controlled the supply, the Church controlled the demand, and together they artificially inflated the price across Europe. Every time a weaver in Flanders or a dyer in London bought the salts necessary for their trade, they were paying a tax to the Medici Bank. The profits were astronomical, funding the art and architecture that we stare at today in awe, rarely considering that the paint was paid for by a continental price-fixing scheme. With the Church's wealth securing their foundation, the Medici turned their eyes toward the monarchies of the North, specifically England and France. This was a dangerous evolution. Kings were notorious for defaulting on loans, often using the sword to cancel the debt. But the Medici believed they had insulated themselves against this risk through the sheer complexity of their network. They weren't just lending money. They were facilitating the international trade that kept these kingdoms functioning. In London, the Medici branch became deeply entwined with the English crown during the Wars of the Roses. They financed the Yorkist king Edward IV, effectively bankrolling a civil war to ensure a friendly regime sat on the throne. This was not a neutral banking service. The Medici were picking winners in foreign conflicts based on who offered the best terms for the wool trade. They were shipping English wool to Florence to be processed, then selling the finished cloth back to England, financing the ships, the insurance, and the king's personal household simultaneously. The sheer volume of data flowing into the Medici headquarters in Florence gave them an information advantage that no government could match. A letter from the London branch manager wasn't just a balance sheet. It contained intelligence on troop movements, harvest yields, and court rumors. Cosimo de' Medici, sitting in his palazzo, often knew about the collapse of a treaty or the death of a duke weeks before the relevant ambassadors did. He used this information asymmetry to manipulate the markets in Florence, buying or selling assets before the news became public. It was insider trading on a continental scale, conducted before the concept of a market regulator even existed. However, this expansion brought the family into a new realm of vulnerability. By becoming the creditors to kings, they tied their survival to the stability of foreign thrones. When Edward IV of England began to falter in his repayments, the London branch didn't just lose money. It faced existential collapse. The Medici managers in London had to cook the books to hide the extent of the bad debt from the partners in Florence, creating a bubble of deception within the bank itself. The centralization that gave them power was beginning to show cracks. Yet, even as the financial structures strained under the weight of bad royal debt, the political capital the Medici had accrued was paying off in ways that gold never could. They had made themselves indispensable. A king might default on a loan, but he could not afford to be cut off from the Medici diplomatic network. The family had woven themselves into the fabric of European diplomacy. They were the intermediaries for peace treaties, the brokers for royal marriages, and the neutral ground for warring states. This transition from merchants to shadow diplomats culminated in the rise of Lorenzo de' Medici. While his grandfather Cosimo had preferred to rule from the backroom, maintaining the fiction that he was just a private citizen, Lorenzo was groomed to treat the bank not as a business, but as a treasury for a state he didn't officially rule. Under Lorenzo, the line between the Medici bank's assets and the Florentine Republic's taxes vanished completely. He began to view the bank's liquidity as a political tool to be spent on soft power, festivals, patronage, and bribes that kept the population sedated and the opposition divided. The crime had evolved. It was no longer about usury or monopoly. The crime was the total capture of the state. The Medici had successfully privatized the Republic. They had created a system where the prosperity of Florence was synonymous with the prosperity of the Medici. To attack the family was to attack the city itself. This psychological conflation was their greatest defense mechanism. They weren't tyrants in the classical sense, ruling by fear alone. They were systemic rulers, ruling by necessity. But as their influence grew, so did the resentment of the old nobility, the ancient families who traced their lineage back to knights and emperors, and who looked at the Medici and saw only up-jumped moneylenders. These families, the Puzzi and the Salviati, realized that they could not beat the Medici in the counting house or the council chamber. The Medici had rigged the game too thoroughly. The ballot boxes were stuffed, the magistrates were bought, and the Pope was their business partner. The opposition realized there was only one way to break the Medici stranglehold. It wouldn't be through a lawsuit, a generic election, or a trade war. It would have to be something much more primal. If the Medici power was concentrated in the persons of Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano, then the solution was to remove those persons from the board entirely. The stage was being set for the most infamous act of violence in the history of the Renaissance, a moment where the banking crime would trigger a blood feud that would stain the altar of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. The ledger was about to be balanced with steel. It is tempting to view what happened next as a simple explosion of violence, a dramatic climax fit for a stage play. But to see the Puzzi conspiracy merely as a blood feud is to miss the cold, hard accounting that underpinned the entire operation. This was not a crime of passion. It was a hostile takeover, an attempted liquidation of a rival firm where the assets were human lives and the boardroom was the holiest site in Christendom. The plan was not just to kill two brothers. It was to sever the head of the Medici Hydra so that the Vatican's new bankers, the Puzzi, could absorb the body. The narrative has always focused on the knives, but we must focus on the ledger. The decision had been made. The Medici account was to be closed permanently. On the morning of April 26, 1478, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore was packed. The air was thick with incense and the murmur of 10,000 Florentines, a sensory overload that the conspirators counted on to mask their movements. Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici arrived, unaware that they were walking into a kill box designed by the Vatican's strategic partners. There is a chilling detail in the archives that exposes the true nature of this plot. The original assassin, a veteran soldier named Montesecco, had backed out. He was willing to kill for money, but he refused to commit murder in front of the altar. The conspirators, desperate to maintain their timeline, had to replace the professional soldier with two priests. They reasoned that men of the cloth would be more comfortable in the sanctuary, a calculation that proves just how far the corruption of currency had eroded the sanctity of the church. The signal for the attack was the raising of the host during High Mass, the most sacred moment of the liturgy, when every head was bowed in reverence. As the bell tolled, the blades came out. Bernardo Baroncelli, a man driven by debt and hatred, drove a dagger into Giuliano de' Medici's chest. The strike was so violent, so frenzied, that Baroncelli reportedly stabbed his own leg in the process. Giuliano staggered and fell, pierced 19 times. The first half of the liquidation was complete. But the second half, the target that mattered most for the political control of Europe, went wrong. The two priests assigned to kill Lorenzo were amateurs in the art of violence. They hesitated. One placed a hand on Lorenzo's shoulder to steady him for the blow, a tactile warning that saved the Magnifico's life. Lorenzo reacted instantly, the blade grazing his neck rather than severing his jugular. Drawing his own sword, he slashed back, vaulting over the wooden choir stalls and sprinting for the new sacristy. His retinue, loyal to the death, slammed the heavy bronze doors shut, barring the assassins from finishing the job. Inside, Lorenzo bled onto the stone floor, listening to the screams of the dying outside. while his friends sucked the wound on his neck, fearing the blade had been poisoned. In that locked room, the Medici bank teetered on the edge of total collapse. If Lorenzo died, the network would dissolve. But he did not die. And outside the cathedral, the Pazzi made a fatal miscalculation about the nature of power.
Jacopo de Pazzi rode into the piazza della Signoria crying out "Popolo e libertà."
People and liberty. He expected the Florentines to rise up and embrace the restorers of the Republic. He expected them to cheer for the end of the Medici tyranny. He had forgotten what the Medici had actually purchased with their decades of patronage. They hadn't just bought art. They had bought loyalty. They had bought the city's identity. The people did not cry for liberty. They cried for the balls of the Medici coat of arms. The city erupted, but not against the Medici. They turned on the conspirators with a ferocity that shocked even the most hardened mercenaries. The retribution was swift and forensic in its brutality. It was a purge. Conspirators were hunted down through the streets. Francesco de Pazzi and the Archbishop Salviati, a man of God who had helped plan a double murder, were captured and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. The visual of the Archbishop, dangling in his ecclesiastical robes, kicking in the air as he strangled, is one of the darkest images of the Renaissance. It was the ultimate symbol of the era. The church and the state fused together in a dance of death, all driven by the flow of gold. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks loudest. If you want to understand the machinery behind the history books, subscribing ensures you're part of every investigation. With the Pazzi dead and the streets washed of blood, one might assume the Medici had won. But in the world of high finance and shadow diplomacy, a tactical victory can be a strategic defeat. The assassination attempt was merely the opening move of a much larger campaign. When news reached Rome that the coup had failed and that his archbishop had been hanged like a common criminal, Pope Sixtus IV did not repent. He doubled down. The Pope couldn't admit he had sanctioned a murder, so he attacked Lorenzo on spiritual and financial grounds.
Excommunicated Lorenzo de Medici.
He branded him a son of iniquity and an enemy of the church. But the spiritual interdict was just the cover for the financial attack. The Pope seized all Medici assets in Rome. He authorized the King of Naples to seize Medici branch assets in the south. In a matter of weeks, the Medici Bank lost a massive percentage of its liquidity. The network that Cosimo had built, the spiderweb that held Europe together, was being torn apart strand by strand. Then came the declaration of war. The Pope and the Kingdom of Naples formed a military alliance to invade Florence and remove Lorenzo by force since the daggers had failed. Florence was alone. Her traditional allies, Milan and Venice, were distracted by their own wars or uninterested in saving a banker who was losing his touch. This is the moment where the banking crime creates a paradox. To fight a war against the Pope, Lorenzo needed money. Massive amounts of money to hire mercenaries, reinforce walls, and bribe officials. But the bank was insolvent. The seizure of assets in Rome and Naples had drained the reserves. So Lorenzo committed the ultimate white-collar sin, one that would have destroyed a lesser man. He went back to the Monte del Dodi, the state-run dowry fund for the daughters of Florence. He raided the accounts. He took the savings of the common citizens, the money meant to secure marriages and futures for the next generation, and he poured it into the war effort. It was embezzlement on a state scale. He was gambling with the life savings of the very people who had cheered for him in the piazza. It was a desperate, criminal act, justified by the terrifying logic of the autocrat. If I fall, everything falls. He made the survival of the Medici synonymous with the survival of Florence, ensuring that the people could not afford to let him lose. But money alone could not stop the Neapolitan army. The forces of King Ferrante, led by the brilliant Duke of Calabria, were marching north, taking fortress after fortress. The Florentine mercenaries were demoralized. The city was starving under the economic blockade. The plague had begun to resurface in the cramped, besieged quarters. The ledger was bleeding red ink, and the steel of the enemy was getting closer. Lorenzo, sitting in his palace, surrounded by art paid for with stolen money, realized the equation had no solution. He could not win on the battlefield. He could not win in the bank. The algorithm of power had turned against him. He needed to change the rules of the game entirely. He needed a move so audacious, so suicidal that no one, not the Pope, not the Puzzy ghosts, and certainly not the historians, would see it coming. He looked at the map. The true military power behind the Pope was Naples. King Ferrante, a man known for mummifying his enemies and displaying them in a private museum of horrors. If Lorenzo could break the alliance between the Pope and Naples, the war would end. But to do that, he would have to go to Naples. He would have to sail directly into the hands of the enemy, unarmed, with nothing but his voice and his checkbook, and convince a tyrant not to kill him. He was going to walk into the lion's den, betting everything on the belief that a king cares more about gold than he does about God. The most dangerous negotiation in the history of the Medici was about to begin. Most historians will tell you that Lorenzo de' Medici sailed to Naples as a diplomat, armed with flowery speeches and the prestige of his family name. They paint a picture of a courageous leader appealing to the rationality of a fellow monarch. But this sanitized version of events obscures the terrified reality of what actually happened in the winter of 1479. Lorenzo did not travel as a statesman. He traveled as a desperate gambler playing his final card. The archives in Naples suggest that when his ship docked in the harbor, he wasn't greeted with pomp and circumstance, but with a silence so heavy it felt like a prelude to execution. He was walking into a city where the king, Ferrante, maintained a private museum of mummified enemies, dressed in their finest clothes, seated at a dinner table, a macabre reminder to anyone who dared challenge his authority. Lorenzo knew this. He knew that by stepping off that boat, he was volunteering to be the next guest at that silent table. The negotiation that followed was not a debate over borders or trade routes. It was a psychological siege. For 3 months, Lorenzo was held in a state of luxurious captivity, never knowing if the next meal would be his last. He had to dismantle the alliance between the Pope and the King of Naples, not with armies, but with the sheer force of his intellect and the implied power of the Medici network. He had to convince Ferrante that a destroyed Florence would only leave Naples vulnerable to the French or the Ottoman Turks. He spun a web of geopolitical fear, arguing that the Pope was a fickle ally who would eventually turn on Naples, whereas the Medici, if allowed to survive, would be a stable, profitable buffer. It was the ultimate con. Lorenzo was promising stability while his own bank was secretly hemorrhaging money, insolvent and teetering on collapse. He was selling a future he couldn't afford to buy, trading on a reputation that was already hollowed out by debt. And it worked. Against all probability, Ferrante was charmed. He saw in Lorenzo a reflection of his own Machiavellian intellect, a man who understood that power was not about morality, but about leverage. They signed the peace treaty. Lorenzo sailed back to Florence not as a corpse, but as the savior of the Republic. The city erupted. They called him Il Magnifico, with a fervor that bordered on religious worship. He had done the impossible. He had stopped a war without drawing a sword. But as the cheers echoed off the stone facades of the Piazza della Signoria, a darker truth was taking root behind the walls of the Medici palace. The victory in Naples had saved his life, but it had destroyed his finances. The cost of the war, the bribes, the mercenaries, and the lavish gifts required to sway King Ferrante had drained the last of the family's liquid capital. To keep the illusion of infinite wealth alive, Lorenzo had to cross a line that even his grandfather Cosimo might have hesitated to cross. He began to embezzle public funds on an industrial scale. The Medici Bank and the Florentine Treasury became indistinguishable. When the bank needed liquidity to cover a bad loan to a foreign prince, Lorenzo simply dipped into the city's tax revenue. But his most egregious crime was against the most vulnerable citizens of Florence. He raided the Monte del Dodi, the state dowry fund. This was a sacred institution where fathers deposited money to ensure their daughters could marry. It was the life savings of the middle class, the future of Florence's families. Lorenzo looted it. He treated the dowry fund as his personal piggy bank, delaying payments, reducing interest, and siphoning off the principal to pay for his diplomatic bribes and his patronage of the arts. The irony is staggering. The golden age of the Renaissance, the era of Botticelli and Michelangelo, was being funded by stealing the marriage prospects of Florentine girls. Every time you look at a masterpiece commissioned during this period, you are seeing money that was stolen from the citizens of the Republic. But because Lorenzo controlled the government, the courts, and the tax collectors, there was no one to prosecute him. He had achieved the ultimate goal of the shadow ruler. He was above the law because he was the law. He created a Council of 70, a hand-picked governing body that stripped the traditional councils of their power. It was a coup in slow motion, a dictatorship dressed up as a republic. The citizens of Florence were losing their liberty, but they were too dazzled by the peace and the festivals to notice. Lorenzo understood the concept of bread and circuses better than any Roman emperor. He kept the city entertained. He staged elaborate justs, masquerades, and carnivals that kept the populace in a state of constant distraction. He patronized the greatest minds of the age, turning his garden at San Marco into the world's first art academy, where a young Michelangelo learned to carve marble. He became the arbiter of taste for all of Europe. If Lorenzo wore a certain velvet, the King of France wanted it. If Lorenzo praised a poet, that poet became famous instantly. He was the original influencer, converting cultural capital into political immunity. But the foundation was rotting. The Medici bank branches in London, Bruges, and Lyon were collapsing one by one, managed by incompetent agents or crushed by the bad loans Lorenzo had authorized to buy political favor. He was bleeding money to maintain the image of the Magnifico. He was the master of Europe, the needle of the Italian balance. Yet he was technically bankrupt. The stress began to manifest physically. The hereditary gout that plagued the Medici men came for him early. By his late 30s, he was often too crippled to walk, carried through the streets of the city he owned but could not pay for. As his health deteriorated, the atmosphere in Florence began to shift. The constant festivals and the pagan-inspired art began to feel decadent, even sinful, to a population that was suffering from the economic stagnation caused by the bank's mismanagement. The dowry theft was an open secret. The people were starting to wonder if the price of Medici glory was too high. And in this vacuum of moral authority, a new voice began to rise. Not a banker or a king or a soldier, but a monk. From the pulpit of San Marco, the very monastery the Medici had paid to renovate, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola began to preach. He didn't speak of Plato or beauty. He spoke of hellfire and judgment. He looked at the golden age Lorenzo had built and saw only corruption. He pointed a shaking finger at the Medici palace and prophesied that the sword of God was coming to strike down the tyrants who stole from the poor to dress themselves in silk. He knew about the dowry fund. He knew about the secret deals with the Pope. He was the anti-Lorenzo, a man who could not be bought, charmed, or intimidated. Lorenzo, the master negotiator who had charmed the killer king of Naples, found himself paralyzed by this emaciated friar. He tried to silence Savonarola with gifts, sending gold to the convent. Savonarola gave the gold to the poor and continued to preach that the Medici were leading Florence to damnation. It was a clash of two worlds: the humanist, secular power of the Renaissance against the medieval, apocalyptic fire of religious fundamentalism. Lorenzo represented the modern world, complex, corrupt, brilliant, and financialized. Savonarola represented the old world, moral, rigid, and terrifyingly pure. By 1492, the year Columbus would sail for the Americas, Lorenzo's body was failing. The gout had moved to his stomach. He was dying at the age of 43. The banking crime that had sustained his family for nearly a century was about to face its reckoning. The network of debt and favors he had woven across Europe was holding together only by the strength of his personality. Without him, the center could not hold. As he lay on his deathbed at his villa in Careggi, the man who had commanded Europe's kings had one final visitor. He didn't call for his doctors or his bankers. He called for the one man he couldn't control. He summoned Savonarola. The scene at the deathbed is shrouded in legend, but the most credible accounts suggest a moment of terrifying clarity. Lorenzo, struggling to breathe, sought absolution for three great sins: the sack of Volterra where his mercenaries had slaughtered civilians, the theft of the dowry fund, and the bloody vengeance he had taken after the Puzzi conspiracy. He was asking for forgiveness for the very acts that had secured his power. He was admitting that the magnificent reign was built on blood and theft. Savonarola stood over the dying godfather of the Renaissance. He did not offer comfort. He offered an ultimatum. He told Lorenzo that God is good and merciful, but for Lorenzo to be saved, he must do three things. First, he must have a true and lively faith in God's mercy. Lorenzo whispered that he did. Second, he must restore everything he had wrongly taken, or order his sons to do so, referring specifically to the stolen dowry money. Lorenzo hesitated, the pain visible on his face, but eventually nodded. Then came the third condition. Savonarola leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a Judgment Day sentence. He told Lorenzo that he must restore the liberty of Florence. He must end the Medici shadow rule and give the Republic back to the people. Lorenzo turned his face to the wall. He did not speak. He could give back the money, he could pray for mercy, but he could not dismantle the power structure his family had spent 3 generations building. To give back the liberty of Florence would be to admit that the Medici were usurpers. It would be to undo his grandfather Cosimo's life work. He chose his dynasty over his soul. Savonarola turned and walked out of the room, leaving the most powerful man in Europe to die unabsolved. The era of the shadow rulers was ending, and the era of the bonfire was about to begin. With the death of Lorenzo, the illusion of stability evaporated. We are often taught that the Renaissance was a steady climb toward enlightenment, a linear progression of art and philosophy funded by benevolent patrons. But the archives suggest a different reality. The golden light of Florence was not the dawn of a new era, but the twilight of a meticulously constructed fraud. The city didn't just grieve, it panicked. The creditors who had been kept at bay by Lorenzo's sheer charisma and diplomatic blackmail now came calling, and the vaults were empty. The Medici Bank, once the engine of Europe, was revealed to be a hollow shell, gutted by years of embezzlement to fund a political theater that had finally run out of actors. The reaction was not merely economic, it was spiritual. Girolamo Savonarola, the friar who had denied Lorenzo absolution, stepped into the vacuum with the force of a biblical prophet. He didn't need to seize power. The Florentines, terrified by the financial and moral collapse of their city, handed it to him. They believed the Medici's bankruptcy was divine judgment, a punishment for decades of usury and excess. Savonarola preached that the only way to save the city was to purge it of the very things the Medici had prized. This culminated in the bonfire of the vanities. In the center of the Piazza della Signoria, where the Medici had once hosted carnivals to distract the populace, a great pyramid of vanities was erected. It was 60 feet tall. Mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothing, playing cards, and musical instruments were thrown onto the pyre. But the true horror for history was the art. Botticelli, the man who had painted the birth of Venus under Medici patronage, was so consumed by the hysteria that he threw his own paintings into the flames. The smoke that rose over Florence that day signaled the death of the Medici dream. The family was exiled, their crests hacked off public buildings, their palace looted. It seemed the dynasty was finished, buried under the ashes of the art they had commissioned. But the Medici had prepared a contingency plan, one that historians often overlook when focusing on the bank's failure. Lorenzo, in his final years, had made one investment that was immune to bankruptcy. He had purchased a cardinal's hat for his son, Giovanni. While the family wandered Europe in exile, begging for asylum, Giovanni was quietly maneuvering within the Vatican, leveraging the last remnants of the family's network. He wasn't a banker like his great-grandfather Giovanni di Bicci. He was a politician bred in the halls of the church. In 1513, the gamble paid off. Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X. The family that had been chased out of Florence as bankrupt criminals now held the keys to heaven. The transformation was absolute. They no longer needed to bribe kings. They could excommunicate them. They no longer needed to hide their power behind a republic. They ruled by divine right. Leo X famously remarked to his brother, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And enjoy it they did. The Vatican under a Medici pope became a reflection of Lorenzo's Florence. Lavish, artistic, and wildly expensive. Leo X emptied the papal treasury as quickly as his father had emptied the bank, spending fortunes on banquets, theater, and the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. To fund this lifestyle, he turned to the only financial instrument he had left: the sale of indulgences. It was banking logic applied to the soul. This is where the Medici story intersects with the fracture of Western civilization. A German monk named Martin Luther looked at this Medici-run church, saw a banking cartel selling tickets to heaven to pay for Renaissance art, and nailed his 95 Theses to a church door. The Protestant Reformation, the wars of religion, the fracturing of Europe, these were, in a very real sense, the collateral damage of Medici financial mismanagement. They had tried to monetize God to cover their debts, and in doing so, they broke Christianity. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks loudest. If you want to understand the machinery behind the history books, subscribing ensures you're part of every investigation. The consequences of their hubris eventually came home to roost. In 1527, under another Medici pope, Clement VII, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor sacked Rome. It was a brutal, bloody humiliation. The Pope was besieged in Castel Sant'Angelo while German mercenaries looted the Vatican. It was the nadir of the family's fortunes, the moment when their manipulation of kings finally backfired. Yet, the Medici possessed a cockroach-like resilience. They survived the sack, they survived the Reformation, and they turned their eyes back to Florence. But this time, the pretense was over. There would be no more first citizen, no more hiding behind the Signoria, no more shadow banking. In 1537, a distant cousin from a younger branch of the family, a teenager named Cosimo I, came to power. The Florentine elites thought he would be a puppet, a weak boy they could control. They were wrong. Cosimo was a new breed of Medici. He didn't care for the subtle arts of persuasion. He preferred the cold efficiency of the state. He executed his political rivals in public. He built a massive mercenary army. He dismantled the last vestiges of the Republic and declared himself Grand Duke of Tuscany. To solidify his control, he commissioned a building that stands today as a monument to administrative tyranny: the Uffizi. We know it as an art gallery, but Uffizi simply means offices. It was built to house the magistrates, the guilds, and the bureaucracy under one roof, right next to the Palazzo Vecchio where Cosimo could watch them. He even built a secret corridor, the Vasari Corridor, connecting his palace to the government offices, allowing him to move unseen above the heads of the citizens, spying on his own government. The transformation was complete. The family that began as gangsters in the Mugello Valley, who became bankers to wash their reputation, who bought the papacy to save their skins, had finally achieved the ultimate goal of all shadow rulers. They became the state. They no longer needed to circumvent the law because they were the law. Cosimo's line would rule for centuries, but the dynamic energy was gone. The banking innovation that had sparked the Renaissance had calcified into a rigid aristocracy. They married into the royal families of France and Spain, their bloodline merging with the very kings they had once manipulated. Catherine de' Medici would become Queen of France, bringing the dark arts of Florentine politics to the French court, orchestrating massacres and maneuvering heirs with the same cold calculation her ancestors had used to balance ledgers. When we look back at the Medici, we must resist the romantic urge to see them merely as patrons of the arts. The statues of Michelangelo and the domes of Brunelleschi are beautiful, yes, but they are also distractions. They are the velvet glove over the iron fist of capital. The Medici proved that, with enough money, you can rewrite the rules of reality. You can turn usury into charity, bribery into diplomacy, and crime into royalty. They created the blueprint for the modern oligarch. They showed that true power isn't about sitting on a throne. It's about controlling the flow of currency that supports the throne. They taught the world that if you own the debt, you own the king. The Bank of the Medici may have closed its doors 500 years ago, but the system they built, the intersection of finance, politics, and surveillance, is still very much open for business. The era of the bonfire ended, but the era of the shadow ruler had only just begun. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks loudest. If you want to understand the machinery behind the history books, subscribing ensures you're part of every investigation.